This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, is sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.
It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. Norway is a small country, but one of the world's most scenic, if you're into graceful and dramatic coastal views. What with its inlets, islands, and fjords, the nation of some 5 million has more than 62,000 miles of coastline. It's excellent hiking territory. But so much of it is steep and deeply forested, so it's not always all that accessible to the casual hiker, which is partly what attracted AP correspondent Brian Witte to a Holland America cruise up and down the Norwegian coast, crossing the Arctic Circle last spring. It wasn't Brian's first trip to Norway or his first European cruise. He joined us to tell us what made this one so special. Brian Witte, let's talk about this cruise to Norway and to the Arctic Circle. First of all, what made you want to go?
Well, I like to go to places that are a little off the beaten path, and this certainly fit that. And I also had some family members who kind of are the same way, and they kind of wanted to go, so kind of made a family trip out of it, a family adventure up to the Arctic Circle, with making some stops at some beautiful places along the way.
How long a trip was it?
It was 2 weeks.
And now you're no stranger to cruises and cruises in Europe. Where have you been, and how does this differ from the ones you've been to before?
I've been on some before. I've been into some cruises in the Mediterranean, and also I did one in the Baltics. And this one was different in that while those are kind of more destination-based, like just making stops in cities, this was different in that it was more scenic-oriented. Those you make stops in some wonderful places, but while you're on the ship, you tend to be at sea, which is fine and is wonderful, but and very relaxing. But there's not a heck of a lot of scenery outside of the water. This one was different in that it was a lot more scenic along the way, going into the fjords of Norway, being able to see a multitude of waterfalls and the long, narrow inlets with steep sides, and you see the towns along the way, which are very small and sort of dwarfed by the large mountains that are towering over them. It was a very pleasant way of seeing a lot of stuff. I mean, the whole trip was about 3,500 miles. And a lot of that was while some of that was out at sea, a lot of it was inside fjords and along the coastline, where you could see towns go by, small villages, and also just lots of natural wonders.
So basically, I mean, it's like going in and out of fjords. It's you must get really close to the shoreline.
You do. You get very close. Some places closer than others. Some of the fjords we went into were narrower than others, and I mean, I was able with a telephoto lens on my camera, I was able to take pictures of villages and even get pretty specific photographs of buildings. You got pretty close indeed.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like hiking without actually getting the hiking boots on and putting the day pack on, and and trying to climb the hills and going over the tree roots to get into nature.
Yeah, it absolutely was like that. It was sort of like going on a day-long hike without leaving the comfort of your floating hotel. I mean, you can sit at the bar and watch it go by. You can have dinner and watch the scenery pass and go about doing all kinds of things on the ship, and you have all of this stuff going by around you. Yeah, I mean, it was heavily based on appreciating nature, and there was plenty of beautiful stuff to see along the way.
Now, you're going into a fjord, out of a fjord, into another fjord. I mean, at some point, did you just say, oh, I've seen this thing before?
When you do start to feel that way, you have plenty of things to go do away from it. A lot of times it's you can socialize, meet with people, have long dinners and watch it go by. But then, it always seemed like while it never really got that old. I mean, sure, there were times when you felt like you had enough and you would take a break and go do something. But then there would always be something special coming along, like a unique. I remember we were in the what's known as the Sognefjord, which is one of the longest and deepest ones, and it's one of the more famous ones. And we were inside there, and we happened to go by a pretty well-known town called Fjords, where there's one of those famous stave churches, and you could see that we were close enough that with some binoculars, or in my case, taking pictures through the telephoto lens, I could see the church very well, and it was quite something. I mean, an architectural marvel from I believe as far back as the 12th century. So you'd see something spectacular like that at one point, and then every now and then you would come up to an especially large waterfall, or you might come across some particularly picturesque village with the very green backdrop with all of the trees that they have. You're always able to see something interesting after a while to keep it of interest.
And what about actual hiking? Did you actually get an opportunity, if somebody wanted to be able to stop and wander through the woods?
Absolutely. Basically, I remember in some of the fjords we went into, you would enter the fjord in the morning, at very early in the morning, 6 a.m., and people would get up and have their coffee or maybe some breakfast and sort of watch as we flowed into the fjord, and then it would make a stop at a village or a town about 4 hours later, and it would be about 10 o'clock or so, or maybe 9, or maybe a little earlier. And that would be the time where you could certainly get out and do some real hiking. And usually you would be in the town for, most of the day until about 4 or 5 o'clock. And you would have plenty of time to either do some hiking or take a bus ride into the mountains or whatever might be near where the stop was.
And what kind of clientele did this particular trip attract? Was it the same sort that you might see on other cruises, or was it different in some way, or were you able to tell?
It was older. It was a lot of older people were on this one. That might have been the fact that it was kind of an off the beaten path one, that what might not be one of the first cruises one would ever go on. And the fact that it enabled you to see quite a bit without necessarily having to be super physically active, it kind of lended itself well to folks who are older and maybe not quite as mobile as they once were.
You've been to Norway before. How's this? What had you seen before, and how's this different?
I was in Norway about a dozen years ago, and it was part of a trip I made in Scandinavia. Made stops in Denmark and Sweden as well. And on that trip, of course, I think as a lot of people are, you're kind of drawn to some of the main sites, the main cities like Oslo, and went to Bergen. But this trip, because of where it went so far north, it it brought you to some places that you might not necessarily think of going the first time you think of going to Norway. So that was also kind of an added bonus of the trip, I thought.
Now, the ship also does, it's not just up close and personal encounters with the sides of fjords. It did stop in some ports, and you did get to actually look at other Norwegian cities, as you say, cities that are not the ones you ordinarily would go to, like Bergen or Oslo. So tell me about some of your city adventures on this trip. Or should I say town adventures?
Yeah, one of the first ones we stopped in was Stavanger, which is a coastal town, which was known for, became known, important in the oil exploration since the 70s. Another nice thing about this trip was that the ports, when the ship docked, it would be a lot of times it would be right next to the town, so you wouldn't need to take a bus or a train to get where you wanted to go. For example, at this stop, the ship pulled right up to the old town, which was very beautiful. It's bright white wooden buildings with orange tiled roofs, and you were able to just basically walk right off the ship and start strolling in this old town. And there were a number of sites in the town. They had an old canning museum, an old fish cannery, dating to the late 19th century, where they produced sardines. It was kind of an interesting little stop for a little while. And then there's a beautiful old stone cathedral that dated to the 1100s. It had unique Baroque, Gothic, and Romanesque elements to it. And then you had a very modern building, a very sleek, modern design of the Norwegian Petroleum Museum that has a very modern interactive displays that lay out the history of oil exploration in Norway. And then that was one of the larger towns, and then we would there were some of the smaller villages where you could go and you would do your hiking, those being in the fjords. But then at other really prominent stops, we stopped in a really beautiful town called Ålesund, which was destroyed in a huge fire in 1904, and then rather rapidly rebuilt in the Art Nouveau style. It was a very, very beautiful, very scenic town. It was almost the downtown area was almost like a large open-air museum for architecture. It was just very pleasant to walk around. And again, the ship docked right next to the downtown. You were within a very short walk of things, and it was very easy to do things on your own if you wanted to. The cruise line had plenty of tours that you could go on if you wanted to, that they would lead. But otherwise, it was very easy to just go about it on your own, just being mindful what time you had to be back at the ship. So there were a lot of other nice stops, too. We stopped in a town called Trondheim, which I had never even heard of before. It's Norway's third largest city and one of the country's oldest. It has a beautiful Gothic cathedral with incredibly striking stained glass windows, and it's a very photogenic city. They have this river that's lined with these brightly colored historic warehouses. So it was just a lot of the towns were just very, very pleasant to stroll around in.
This is Get Outta Here, the AP travel podcast. We're talking with AP correspondent Brian Witte about his recent trip on a cruise to northern Norway and the Arctic Circle. We'll be back after a break.
Download the AP News app for the latest in news, sports, travel, entertainment, and more. Available now for iPhone and iPad.
It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson talking with the AP's Brian Witte. So, Brian, to the extent that Americans know about Norway, it's far north, it's cold, you went in the spring. What was the weather like?
It was late May and early June. The weather was really, it's very funny because the folks on the cruise ship, and you would always want to try to get an idea of what the weather would be like the the next day. Do I need to bring an umbrella? Do I need to bring do I need to dress in layers? Do I need to wear a heavy coat? All of which I brought to be prepared, because we were indeed going to some cold places. But it's the kind of the running joke was, well, in Norway you can experience all 4 seasons in one afternoon, which is what I found to be only a mild exaggeration. You really can have some very fast changing weather. It can be raining in a 15-minute period, and then 15 minutes later it's brightly sunny, and then a half hour later the clouds are coming in again, and it just moves very, very swiftly, which is kind of nice because it gives you a variety of different things, different ways of looking at things, and different color and on the reflecting off of the water. If you like to take photographs, and if it started out one way that you didn't like, you usually could be pretty confident that it would change to a more pleasant sort of weather later in the day, but then it would probably also change back. So it was very fast moving, and it could be a great variety of things. But for the most part, it wasn't terribly cold when we got to the more northern stops after we went across the Arctic Circle. It did indeed get cold, but it was bearable. I brought sweaters and layers and a heavy parka and a hat, and that was all I needed.
Tell me about the Arctic Circle aspect of this trip. What part of the attraction was that, and how did you know you were across the Arctic Circle?
Well, it was kind of a fun feature of the trip, and of course, going at this time of year, you have the very long days where there were parts of the trip where you had daylight for 24 hours. So that was kind of a fun and interesting experience to be out at 1 in the morning and it looking like it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, where the sun was still up and the sun never set. So that was a kind of a nice feature, and you really they never made an announcement like you have arrived. I guess you kind of would ask around, and I remember at the end of the trip they gave out a certificate telling people when they arrived into the Arctic Circle and when they left. We were there for about 3 days, but the defining characteristic of it, of course, is the 24-hour daylight, which is fairly interesting. We made 2 stops up there. We stopped in the town of Hammerfest, which is known as the world's northernmost city. It has a population of about 8,000 people, and it's an interesting town. I basically just got out and walked around. They have a little tourism center known as and a place inside of it known as the Royal and Ancient Polar Bear Society, which is inside the town's city hall. It was founded in 1963 with the idea of preserving the Hammerfest tradition of hunting and fishing. It includes a lot of stuffed animals and some exhibits dealing with how people lived in the challenging weather they have there sometimes. And then we also made a stop in Honningsvåg, which was interesting. And one of the main things you would do there is take a bus to the North Cape, which is considered to be the northernmost part of Europe that is accessible by car, and it has very sweeping views out over the sea. And there's a visitor center there with a shop and some places where you can take in the scenery, and a movie theater that shows a film about the area. So that, of course, it was kind of interesting to be that far north and thinking about where you are in the world. It was still about 1,300 miles from the North Pole, but you're pretty far north at that point, and kind of an interesting ride up to the North Cape where you can take in the scenery and maybe even see a couple of reindeer.
Did you find yourself daydreaming at some point in those northern places what must it like to actually live up here in this particular atmosphere with the sweeping views and the, long light in the summer and short light in the winter?
Yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting place to live, no doubt about it. It would be, I'm sure the winters must be really, which I did not experience in any way, shape, or form, but those would take some getting used to, I'm sure. But on the other hand, it's kind of interesting to have all of that daylight too. So I guess you kind of make that trade-off. But it's very remote. You feel very far away from things, and it's kind of interesting in that respect.
Well, we can't talk about this without talking about what is uppermost in a lot of people's minds, which is climate change. I mean, do you see evidence anywhere? Is it on people's minds? We keep hearing about things like ice melt in northern latitudes, giant ice melt in Greenland, for instance. So is there a sense that people in northern Norway are very much aware that things are changing?
Well, it's interesting. I remember the oil museum in Stavanger had an exhibit about mentioning climate change. And then, as you would go around, you would kind of look. A lot of these places were right on the water, and either on the fjord or on a river running through one of the cities. And I didn't really see any evidence of flooding there, but I didn't really. And it is kind of interesting to be that far north and not necessarily feel it as cold as you might think, as you might expect it to be. It's definitely something that people are thinking about and talking about. But not like I wasn't really able to observe anything other than, like I say, it was you're up there and you're thinking it's not really that cold, and we're pretty far north. But then again, it was summer.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it depending on how you're thinking. At any place you go now, in a coastal location, you can't help but think, well, what would this be like with like a foot higher sea level? And that kind of changes things. Okay, what are you dying to tell me that I've left out here? What do you want to make sure everybody knows about this trip?
I think we've covered it pretty well. I mean, we also, as we came back, you make the trip up there very far north, and then you come back and you go back into the fjords again, and you see some more of that spectacular scenery, and then also made the one of the last stops in the town that I mentioned I'd been to a dozen years ago, the town of Bergen. Very beautiful town with a lot of history to it, and it was one of the more cosmopolitan places that we stopped. It had lots of culture and large fish market and some really impressive art museums, and including one that had a couple of rooms of their famous painter Edvard Munch. So that was a very pleasant highlight at the end there, stopping in the beautiful town of Bergen.
Oh, that's great. Well, this is the essentially the goal in every story we do on this show is at the end of the interview, do you want to go there? Well, I definitely want to go there, and I'm a little jealous that you got to go. But Brian Witte, thanks a lot.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful place.
Brian Witte is an Associated Press correspondent in Maryland, covering politics and government from the state capital in Annapolis. By way of disclosure, we should note Holland America's parent company, Carnival, is a sponsor of this podcast. A postscript on Brian's trip: just after he left Norway, the Oil and Gas Museum in Stavanger mounted a major exhibit on the challenges presented by climate change, a big threat to a country so culturally dependent on its coastline, to say nothing of one that's become economically dependent on the fossil fuel industry. And now, my favorite trip. Robert Benchley, the Algonquin Roundtable humorist, famously said traveling with children corresponds roughly to traveling third class in Bulgaria. Bethany Joy Lenz might beg to differ. She's one of the stars of the USA TV series Pearson, a spin-off of Suits, now best known as the employer of Meghan Markle before she went off to become Duchess of Sussex. Lenz is back from a great trip she took through Europe with her daughter, and she told our entertainment writer Alicia Rancilio all about it.
For a month, we just kicked off.
And how is it traveling for a month with a child in Europe?
It was great. She's 8, so she's totally capable of, walking, carrying her own. The first day, here's what we did. We did a month in Europe, 2 carry-ons, 2 backpacks. I was not messing around with checked luggage in all the different places we were going. So we put her backpack on, and then she starts dragging her carry-on, which was pretty light, and it was within, 30 minutes. It's too heavy, can't do it. And I'm thinking, oh, this is good. Yeah, she's going to get strong, okay. And sure enough, within 2 days, she was like, oh, it's not that bad, it's fine. And, it was so cool to watch her just get stronger and have the wonder of seeing all the things and talking to people who are the same, but they speak a different language, or finding out about different customs that are, people that function completely differently than we do. And, she's really young still, so I don't know that she was really cognizant of all of that, but I hope and believe that it was slowly working its way in there. I tried to point things out as much as possible.
That's so cool.
It was great. It was really great. Yeah.
Is traveling something that's very important to you?
It is. There's a part of me that's like, oh, you've seen one cobblestone road, you've seen them all, but the people are the same all over, and the differences are always interesting to me, because on a level of human nature, we all sort of wrestle with the same issues, the same wants and desires, but how we go about doing it based on our cultural petri dish.
It must be interesting as a mom, though, because you want to raise your child to be a citizen of the world.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that's great to take her on that trip.
Yeah, I want her to be exposed to all different kinds of things, to have empathy for all different cultures, and just be able to go anywhere and adapt quickly. We spent a lot of time, I made sure we would get to airports and train stations early so that she could tell us where we were going. I'd teach her how to look at the ticket, how to, who to talk to if you don't know how to find directions and things like that. So it was fun.
Was she involved in the packing of the carry-on?
No. She was sitting in the corner watching I Love Lucy on my computer, like, good luck, Mom, sucking on a lollipop or something. I tried, but you got to pick your battles,
Bethany Joy Lenz is a star of Pearson on the USA Network. She spoke with our Alicia Rancilio. And that's the show. Get Outta Here is a production of the Associated Press, produced under the supervision of Peter Costanzo and Makessa Moody. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.
This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, was sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.